Madeline and I are like figures of fine glass. The slightest touch and we may shatter. Both of us suffer from a morbid acuteness of the senses. Mine is the worse for having existed the longer, but both of us are afflicted with it. Any sort of food more exotic than the most pallid mash is unendurable to my taste buds. Any sort of garment other than the softest is agony to my flesh. My eyes are tormented by all but the faintest illumination. Odors assail me constantly, and as I've said, sounds of any degree whatsoever inspire me with terror. I can hear the scratch of rat claws in the walls, Mr. Winthrop. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, lucky episode 13. And we've chosen to talk about the Vincent Price film, The House of Usher. Mel, as you were reading that opening quote, I had to put my hand over my mouth and not giggle as you were reading it because it is the most melodramatic thing I've ever heard in my life. So when I've seen The House of Usher several times, but I rewatched it for this before we did this podcast recording. So just to kind of catch our listeners up, we are talking about The House of Usher, the one from 1960. It was directed by Roger Corman, and I believe it was the first of his Poe movies. So he did a bunch of them. This, I think, is one of the better of his Poe movies because some of them just take the name itself and don't really have much to do with the plot. And this was a pretty faithful adaptation. I like the way they did it. But this was also written by Richard Matheson. So he's a podcast favorite. Of course, he did I Am Legend and Hell House and Stir of Echoes and What Dreams May Come. And I had forgotten or maybe never known that he had actually written this. But let's talk about this quote for just a minute and why it just tickles me. So this is coming from Roderick Usher, who is played by Vincent Price. And this is where he's telling Philip Winthrop, who is Madeline's suitor and has come to whisk her away and marry her. And he's explaining what is wrong with the family and this kind of sickness that has overtaken Madeline. And basically he says that they are too precious for this world. They can't take they can't have any loud noise. They can't eat like food that is, I guess, extra spicy. But there's a lot of talk of them eating gruel throughout the film. The thing that really got me, and it wasn't the scratch of the rat claws in the walls, although that was a great line. It was when he said, any sort of garment other than the softest is agony to my flesh. Because that really just thought, well, I mean, this is basically The Princess and the Pea turned into a horror movie because they are too precious for this world and they can't take, scratchy fabric touching them because it torments them so much. But I really thought, in reality, even though it does make me laugh, I liked the way it highlighted, because this is in the Poe story too, this upper class, middle class, lower class structure that you see. And the Ushers do represent this kind of dying aristocracy, which is in a lot of Gothic fiction. But I think that quote is pretty brilliant. I mean, like I said, it's melodramatic and it's funny, but it's pretty brilliant on Matheson's part because it does highlight how the Ushers are part of this kind of upper crust class that really has been so sequestered due to their I would guess both their wealth, um, but also just the class structure system that now they can't exist in the real world anymore. I don't I don't know. Maybe I'm reading way too much into this and I've got my professor hat on too much in what is meant to just be a silly quote, but I don't know. Mel, I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this movie.
It was kind of difficult to read this one without laughing. It reminded me a little bit of when I was reading the intro to the Plan 9 from Outer Space episode because it is so melodramatic, especially that part about the garment in the very last part. Um, I also like the part when Mr. Winthrop gets mad at him at the end, and first he threatens him with an axe, and then he tries to strangle him, and then he's like, "I can't kill you." And so he literally is just like touching him all over, and he's screaming because his skin is being cut by the threads. It's like he's touching him to death. It's like he's actually more bothered by that than having an axe held over his head. It's very dramatic. But no,
Well, and the fact
go ahead.
the fact that we didn't talk about this, but Vincent Price throughout, I would say a good 3/4 of this movie carries, what is it, a lute?
Yes.
A lyre? I mean, what is that he's carrying?
I think they call it a lute. I'm not sure if it's a real, like actually what a lute is, but I think that's what they call it. And he can touch the strings and it doesn't bother him, but God forbid if you touch his shoulder or something, he's tortured.
Well, as he's playing it, I think at one point he even says, "I could hear you coming." And Philip says, "Oh, well, is that why I was supposed to take my shoes off when I entered, your home, so that the clacking of my shoes doesn't bother your sensitive ears?" And he's like, "Yeah, I could still hear you coming." And so he's very put out by the fact that Philip is there, that even Philip's socked feet on the floor is too much for him to bear, yet he can sit here and pluck this this stringed instrument and it's fine. I guess, like I said, I think that's where it was really like highlighting, for me anyway, the class issue that is really at the heart of both the Poe story and this movie.
He can even listen
Yeah,
to the
I
horrific
don't know.
music and it's fine too. Yeah.
Right.
No, I agree with you that there's like a kind of gothic class issue going on here, which is tied. One of the things I think they do really well in the movie is, Roger Corman said, according to legend about the movie, that the house is the monster. And they do a really good job of tying the gothic house and the gothic estate to the family and to those class issues, just like in Poe's story. In Poe's story, the house has kind of a sentience, but it's not. With the fungus and the phosphorescence and all that, and the house kind of falling apart because the ushers are falling apart, but it's not explored like it is in the movie. In the movie, the house is actually trying to hurt Winthrop, throwing coals at him, dropping chandeliers on him because it's so tied to the ushers. And it's not just that they're of a different class. Well, Mr. Winthrop, he also is pretty, I think he's probably of a similar class to them, but not like that old New England kind of aristocracy that they're trying to play up. But another thing about them is because of their class and because of all their money and because of having been planted in this country like forever, they're able to get away with a lot. And so they are also, they don't just have madness and possible afflictions that may or may not be real because of incest, which they admit. He talks about, having a straight family tree. But also, when he shows all the portraits, every single generation of Usher has been free to, because of their money and their power, do whatever they want. So first, their fortune is built on the slave trade. And then from then on out, it's like any sort of smuggling, piracy, bootlegging, murdering, con artistry, harlotry, as he lists, every possible sin you could think of, they do, and they don't seem to get any repercussions. And I'm assuming it's because of their class. And then, like every good Southern Gothic does, right? You have to, and if you think of Old Gothic too, you have to keep your bloodlines pure to the point where no one can marry in. at all, because you've got to just be ushers. And so I think there's a lot of class issues going on in this movie. Um, and then, of course, you have Madeline, which we talked a little bit, I think, previously to this recording about how, her, the treatment of her in the movie too is kind of tied to that and comes off of it as well. But yeah, I agree with you that there's a lot of issues with class here, and American Gothic often would stage class as like the big boogeyman in the horror, because we like to think that that's in the past in Europe and early America, and not something that we have to deal with in our history. And I think the movie is kind of playing off of that.
Yeah, it is. And this is, if we're looking at this from a Gothic tradition, then this, in a weird way, this movie does bridge the American Gothic with the kind of early British Gothic tradition, because going all the way back to what you were talking about with the house being evil. And that is one of the ways that this story takes a different path in the Poe story, because in the Poe story, the house is, even though the house, he describes it as looking like a face when the traveler comes upon it, and he talks about, the windows looking like eyes and the moss hanging like hair, but it's still definitely tied to the Usher family and that lineage. And so if the house possesses any madness in the Poe story, it's only because the Ushers themselves possess madness. But in this adaptation of it, and I think we had talked about it before we started recording this too, that we had seen definite connections between this and like Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, where in The Haunting of Hill House, you have the same sort of American aristocracy, I guess, and people who have had that access to the kind of money and power that they, like you said, they almost feel untouchable and they can do what they want. But that crossing over into a house then becoming bad in and of itself just because of what happened there. So the very kind of, well, it's the trope of the bad place, isn't it? But here you have, and they even said that the house itself is evil and it's acting evil because of the past evil that was committed there. So it's almost like, yes, the house is bad because the ushers were bad, but the ushers were so bad for so long that it just kind of seeped not only into the house itself, but then there's the implication that that is passed on to Madeline too, that it lives in Madeline and it lives in Roderick, just because they are in the space too. So it becomes this like parallel line of evil, right? And there, I guess the Roderick and Madeline are getting the worst of it because now they've lived in the bad place for so long that it is starting to affect them. But then they've also come from such a bad lineage that they're getting the dose of evil there too, and so they kind of have no choice. This is from Roderick's point of view, but from being to be bad, and the idea of the sins of the father visited on the children. That's such an interesting idea because that goes back to the very first Gothic novel when you look at the Castle of Otranto. That's absolutely in there all the way back to Walpole. And it's also a very Hawthornian idea when you're looking at the American Gothic too. So this is a really weird mix of the two Gothic traditions kind of marrying in one adaptation. I don't know. It's kind of neat looking at it from that point of view.
Yeah, it is very Hawthorne like. One of the things when I was watching it this time, I was like, wow, this is anticipating by 3 years the movie The Haunting, based on The Haunting of Hill House. And Richard Matheson wrote Hell House, so obviously he reacted to Shirley Jackson's book. And possibly the book may have been an influence on Usher, but I think you're right about the kind of what we think of as the older European or English Gothic, like Otranto, but House of the Seven Gables. I mean, it's not the exact same plot, but very similar. You know, a house is built by a powerful person who's untouchable, who basically murders through witch accusation the person who owns the land, who had previously taken it from the Native Americans that were there. And then the rich guy builds his big house and is kind of like evil from the beginning because it's the mall house. And in that one, you have somebody come in from the outside who actually isn't really coming in from the outside. They just think he is. But you have a marriage and it ends up kind of turning things on their head. Like the sins of the father kind of stop with them. Like there's a way to recuperate yourself and to get out of this cycle. I thought it was interesting that they inserted, instead of having the typical narrator in the Usher tale, they insert Mr. Winthrop as this possible romantic rescue for Madeline because somehow she went to Boston. We talked about how we can't figure out how, and hung out with a whole bunch of people,
That's
including
never
Mr.
explained.
Winthrop. No, it's not. And all the friends that she met, and Mr. Winthrop missed her, and that's why he came. So they offer that romantic escape, I guess, but it's taken away because it's Poe. So the Usher line kind of succeeds. But yeah, I thought of House of Seven Gables too because it's the idea of like you end the cycle at some point. But in this movie, the cycle doesn't end. Like Mr. Winthrop just barely survives all the horror that happens because he can't overpower the fact that the Ushers believe that they're just kind of like genealogically as evil and screwed up as their previous generations, and they just feel trapped there. Though, like you said, we don't know how Madeline managed to escape to Boston only to come back. But there's that glimpse of another path.
Yeah, Madeline's a really interesting figure, and I want to talk about her just a little bit. So she's played in this adaptation by the actress Myrna Fahey, who I recognized her, and I had to go look her up. She was in the Disney Zorro, so that's where I had recognized her from, at least. Just if any listeners grew up watching the old Zorro that used to, it would sometimes show on the Disney Channel. But yeah, she's a really interesting character because we get a little hint of her when we do find out that she had at some point been in Boston. So I don't know if she had been there for school, but she had escaped the House of Usher at some point and was living a relatively normal life. And then what I took as a rather abrupt departure from Boston, because none of her friends really knew what happened to her and they all missed her. So either she just up and left one day rather mysteriously, or possibly she told them, I'm going to go home and visit for a while and then come back, and then she didn't. But we never really get that backstory. We just know that she left and she came back home at some point. And now this is what prompts Philip to come to her. We don't see her until rather late into the movie. I don't know exactly when she comes in. I'll say maybe a third into the movie is when we see her, if I'm just guessing. So there's a lot of talk about her before we ever actually see her. And from the very beginning, when you see Philip coming up to the door, so you have the great scene of him coming into the creepy Usher house and the Usher estate, and everything is dead and it looks very gray, and I'm pretty sure there was fog, because of course there'd be fog around the House of Usher at all times probably. But he's knocking on the door and he's very insistent on coming in. So you get the sense right away that he's desperate to see her. So this has possibly been going on for a while, where he's been trying to get in touch with her and he can't. And finally he's just like, I have to see her. I have to know she's okay. So there's that kind of desperation. But when he gets in, he meets Roderick and doesn't see Madeline right away. And Roderick is a really interesting character. He, of course, is played, as we said, by Vincent Price. he is the one who says that Madeline is sick and that she's hidden away. And Roderick says, "Well, I want to marry her. I want to see her. I want to take her away from this place." And the fact that Madeline has a suitor is kind of funny to Philip. And he laughs off the fact, or Roderick laughs off the fact that Philip would want to marry his sister. And he especially thinks it's funny that Philip would ever want to have children with Madeline because he basically says, "Look, we have a tainted family line. This is where you get the whole we are too precious for this world speech." But that, Roderick is very clear. I do not want my sister to have children. And this is Mel, and Mel, I know you have thoughts on this, so I'm really anxious to hear them. But Madeline is the reason that Philip is there. Roderick has his own issues with his sister, which I'm sure we'll talk about in just a minute. So she's the inciting incident for this entire movie. And yet we haven't seen her yet. And we just have the two, arguably the two most important men in her life that are debating her future. They're debating her future relationships, they're debating her future children, and she's nowhere in sight. Like I said, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this, Mel, because I know you have some.
Well, I mean, my thoughts kind of come down to just what you were just saying, is that the vast majority of the movie is a contest or a debate between two men over the woman's body. And as I wrote in the notes, especially her womb. As the woman in the movie, she has the power to continue the Usher family or not, right? And so Philip wants to marry her to produce his children. Because remember, he's like, why would I marry her and not have children? He says that like 2 or 3 times in the movie. He doesn't understand that because that's her purpose, if they get married. And then her brother, who I probably, has some feelings for her that maybe mimic Philip from some of the things that happen in the movie, we don't know, but he's basically trying to keep her there because he says her ability to have children is what's dangerous because she can produce children that will be more evil and mad ushers. And so it kind of reminded me of a lot of literature where in the story things that happen with children, whether it's legitimacy or purity, etc., is often laid at the feet of the woman in the story, even if this has something to do with the man in the relationship as well, because the woman can produce the children, so therefore the woman that bears the brunt of that control and that punishment. So it kind of doesn't matter if she wants to go with Philip or not go with Philip. She just kind of, when she's in Boston, she's with him, and that seems cool. And when she's in Usher, she's trapped in the House of Usher. There's not a lot of agency in her situation until she busts out of the coffin and decides to kill Roderick. But even then, he says she's deranged and infuriated and like hysterical and can't think straight. So it's more like vengeance or reaction. So yeah, I mean, I feel like Madeline just is kind of a pawn that just gets pushed back and forth between the two men just because she can produce children.
She absolutely is a pawn. And you're right that they're not only debating her future, but they're specifically fighting over her body and who has control over, like you said, not just her body, but specifically her womb, which is disturbing on many levels. But at the same time, it is a tale, a tale as old as time, isn't it? But one thing that I find really interesting, and I want to go back to when we were talking about the fact that Madeline apparently has this mysterious backstory where she did go to Boston, and we don't learn much about it. Now, knowing that Matheson wrote this, and I can't help but wonder why he gave us that little detail. Like, part of me thinks he just needed a reason for Philip to be in love with her, right? For he needed some plausible explanation for why a suitor would be knocking on the door. Although I think in this type of gothic story, you really don't need that. Like you could just have somebody who has heard, oh, there's a beautiful woman who lives here who is eligible for marriage, and I don't know. He's a opportunist who's looking for, a way to get it to the Usher fortune or something. I don't know. There would have been a reason, I think, for a suitor to have shown up without even having seen Madeline, or maybe just having seen glimpses of her, because she's certainly a beautiful actress who plays her. But the fact that Matheson gave Madeline this mysterious backstory where she does go to Boston, and she apparently, she has friends, she has a boyfriend, she's apparently living a great life. And then you have Roderick, who is so insistent that there's something wrong with the Usher family, that there's this madness that, and not just madness, but an evil madness that is connected to their family. And it almost makes me wonder if you can't read this particular adaptation in two different ways. One way is that everything that Roderick is saying is absolutely true. That there is some sort of evil curse that is surrounding the Usher family, and that he is absolutely right to make sure that they are the last of the Ushers, that the Usher name dies with them, that the family line dies with them, that the house will just crumble into nothing. And once they die, the world will be rid of their evil. But another reading of it could be that Roderick himself is possessed of some sort of madness. And as you pointed out, a possible desire for his sister that he's very uncomfortable with. And he is the one who coaxes Madeline back home after she has gotten away, and kind of planted the seed in her head that there is something evil and hysterical about her, that there is something mad about her. And she has become she's almost become brainwashed by his own delusions. And if we read the movie that way, then when he tries to kill her by burying her alive, then we understand that mad woman who comes out of the coffin, right? Because she's overcome either with a believed, kind of an ingrained thought of, well, I'm evil, so this is what I do, or a really strong sense of retribution and vengeance. And that's what we're seeing. Um, so I thought that was really interesting, because to me, I feel like Matheson gave us that little detail of this possible other life that she led in Boston, so that we could read Roderick in a couple of different ways. Did you see that at all, Mel?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an ambiguity there. Like when I was watching the movie this time, I was leaning more toward, Roderick is mad and brainwashing her, and she's just stuck in this situation. Like she doesn't necessarily, she feels like she doesn't have a choice. And maybe her coming back from the dead and trying to kill Winthrop and Roderick is her just trying to like take vengeance. Like she's just righteously angry, which I would be too if I was buried alive, though I don't know if I'd be able to get out of it. Um, but they really do play up the fact that he knows she's not dead when he boxes her up, which in the story is kind of ambiguous because she does have the cataleptic trances. So I definitely think you could read it both ways, especially since she goes to Boston. Maybe she is trying to escape. I also feel like sometimes there are little hints that maybe this whole like genealogical evil in the house as a monster kind of comes to the fore too, because Winthrop who has nothing to do with any of this, has that bizarre dream when he's so upset with good reason after he thinks she's been buried alive, or everything is blue and hazy, and he's trying to find a secret place where she's hidden, where he sees all the ushers coming back and gloating over the fact that this evil thing has happened. I wondered if, like, why he would see them, unless there is something to this weird, like, evil house, evil usher presence. And when he's running out of the house trying to get out of the, when it's on fire, there's the implication with all the moaning and screaming coming from the portraits that the usher portraits are haunted. I don't, if we're looking at it from the perspective of the surviving person who's running out of the building, I don't know why he would hear that, or we would be hearing that, or showing those portraits, unless maybe there was something, a possibility that they were evil. So I feel like you could watch the movie 3 or 4 different times and kind of lean both ways depending upon which evidence you pull from it. I know that's kind of trying to have it both ways, but I feel like it kind of balances on that pendulum, little pun there, po pun, um, and could go either way, because you can pick little instances in the movie that support either interpretation.
You could, and that was an apt pun, because wasn't the Pit and the Pendulum the next adaptation that Corman took on?
It
Because I'm
was.
pretty sure that one came out in 61.
Yeah, I think
I think that's
so.
right.
It was the second one, yeah, and I think it was 61 when it came out.
Yeah, that one was not as faithful of, of an adaptation as this one. And you know, I think, and I will say this is a good adaptation, and this movie I still really thoroughly enjoyed. I think a lot of that is owed to Richard Matheson's writing. I think the fact that it was a faithful adaptation, and that it's just a good story and a good movie all around. But going back to what you were talking about with the nightmare and kind of the strange things that Philip does see, because you're right, if we get things through Philip's eyes and not just through Roderick's, it takes away a little bit of the ambiguity. But Philip is a very rational person, and he shows that several times throughout the story. So he does not think the house is attacking him, for instance, when he's burned by the fireplace. I don't think, Roderick was like, "Ooh, the house is trying to get you," and he was kind of like, "Or." there was a gust of wind, and even when the chandelier falls, and he says, "Oh, well, obviously it's because your house has a giant crack in it, and it's causing it to shake." Even Philip kind of recognizes, you're just letting this house fall apart. You're not even trying to fix it. And of course, from Roderick's point of view, he's like, he wants the house to fall apart. That's what he wants. He wants his sister to die, and then him to die, and then the house to fall into what did they call it? The tarn?
Yeah, the
To
tarn.
fall into the tarn. And then that be the end of it. So he has no interest in fixing up the house or anything. Philip is very practical in that sense. However, when he does start to see some of the crazy things, because even when he sees, there are a few good jump scares in this movie, because this is a horror movie. One of them occurs when he is actually touring, I guess they'd be called catacombs, with Madeline, as she's showing them, these are all my ancestors, there's mom and dad and grandma and grandpa. And then she points out, and that's for me and my brother. And you kind of see the
That's not weird at all.
psychological. No, that's not weird. But you see the psychological torture that her brother has clearly put her through, or her family even. I mean, it's creepy and it's crazy. And at that point, the house shakes again, and a skeleton rolls out, and he takes it very calmly. See, I jumped, and I knew it was coming. And, Madeline screams and faints away, but he doesn't start having the nightmares and stuff until after he thinks she's been murdered, until he thinks she has been buried alive. And I think there's a couple of things to note there. Yes, it could be that the house is evil and it's the monster and it's playing its mind tricks on Philip. Or Philip is experiencing extreme grief. He's already been in a very scary house. He's heard all these stories about, and Roderick, of course, being Vincent Price, is a very effective storyteller. He's already been hearing about all these evil ancestors who still lurk around and whose ghosts are still around. And the paintings themselves, you can't just say these are paintings of their ancestors. If I saw any of those paintings in a room, I would run away. Like, we are underscoring how absolutely creepy they are before anything starts to happen. Like, he is in a creepy house with creepy people, with creepy paintings hanging on the wall, and he's been hearing creepy stories. And then now you add grief on top of it. It does not surprise me at all that he would have the nightmare that he had, or that he would be hearing things as he was running out of the house.
That's true.
So, but I will say that the nightmare that's one of my favorite scenes in it, because there are all these just like crazy, creepy faces and an abundance of blue and purple fog, and it's wonderful. Like, I love that. It does feel so absolutely nightmarish. I love it.
I mean, maybe the whole movie is just a meditation on madness. And everybody is mad by the end of it.
Who's
including
madness?
the viewer.
I think that's the
question. Here's a question I have for you, Lisa. At the end, when Madeline's coming to kill Usher, why does he go get a gun? Like, he's been wanting to die the whole movie, right? So that was something that got me. I'm like, is he just a murderer? Is he just evil like all the Ushers? He just wants to kill Madeline for his own selfish purposes. There's no reason for him to get something to protect himself from her if his whole plan is to kill her so she can't have children and then waste away and die.
That is a good question. He had said something earlier on that, what did he say? He had said that 3/4 of the family had fallen to madness. This is when, after he gives us "We're too precious for the world" speech. And he's explaining to Philip why he can't have children with Madeline. And he's saying 3/4 of our family have fallen to madness. And then he says, and then they're overtaken, basically, I'm paraphrasing here, by like a mysterious illness, and they die only to come back with super strength.
Mm-hmm.
So he basically, and this is where I think it's really kind of showing the madness of Roderick, because he fully believes the stories that he's telling. And I think in that moment, he's terrified of what Madeline has become, because he basically paints it out as they all come back as these like super strong zombies. And I think that's what he's seeing.
But she does kind of. I mean, how would she be able to get out of that heavy slab over the coffin and the chains?
The bloody hand coming out of the coffin was kind of frightening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Maybe she is a super strong zombie by the end.
I mean, I hate the fact that I'm starting to agree with the mad Usher, but
it's just the part of the story. Like,
human strength.
Roderick he's gotten to you.
He has. That's funny.
Or maybe he goes and gets the gun because he really does not want, this is something we haven't thought about, but maybe he doesn't want her to die at all. I mean, I think the whole family has an unhealthy obsession with death.
Mm.
And I don't but maybe he doesn't like maybe the only reason he locks her in the coffin is not to kill her, but to make Philip go away.
That could be. Or he might get the gun because he would rather shoot himself than have her tear him limb from limb with her superhuman strength.
Or he's hoping Philip will go away and then he can go rescue sister and live happily ever after with her.
Maybe.
Maybe he didn't really think she was going to come back with superhuman strength. Maybe that was just a story he told Philip to scare him away. I don't know.
He definitely wants Philip to get out of the house.
Yeah. And maybe it's not some sort of supernatural strength. Maybe it's just Madeline got that angry.
That could be too, and that's an interesting way of looking at it. That she literally just is female anger because she's not very discriminating in who she attacks when she comes back. I mean,
No, she goes after Philip
hmm
and
and
I mean
Bristol.
I
She
mean she
threatens
seems
Bristol too.
right. She seems we need to talk about his his character too, but I mean she seems more intent on getting to her brother, but you're right. She attacks Philip with just as much enthusiasm as she does her brother. So yeah, I mean, it could just be. I kind of like that reading. Like, if we're gonna read this as almost a feminist horror movie, where the movie literally opens with the men fighting over her future and her reproductive ability, and then in the end, it's that female anger that has turned her into the monster.
Yeah, I kind
I
of
kind
like
of
that
like that.
reading. Yeah, yeah. And it is the men kind of oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Is the men are susceptible to bouts of hysteria and madness as they claim that she is. So, that's an interesting touch there too. I mean, it could also be like the horrors of domestic life, like the inverse of the house and what we think of as a domestic. Like she literally has to be imprisoned alive or killed to be forced to take this position, kind of like the mad woman in the attic type idea. But she bursts out of it and kills, tries to kill the men and sets the house on fire. It's kind of like Bertha and Jane Eyre. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
Burning down
they're
the house that
absolutely a shape
imprisoned
with that.
you. Yeah, burning down the family that's imprisoned you too. Yeah.
Because I definitely got the feeling, and I think it was because of the way Philip comes to the house demanding to be let in. He doesn't just knock on the door and ask to come to dinner. Like, he wants to get in and he's on a mission to save her. So you get she is set up as a prisoner from the very beginning. We just don't know why she's a prisoner. Is she a prisoner because her brother's keeping her there, or is she a prisoner because she's ill and can't leave? Kind of a prisoner to this inherited madness. But she's definitely, absolutely presented as a prisoner from the very beginning. So I kind of like that Mad Woman in the Attic, Jane Eyre reading of that. That's really the only choice left to her by the end is to destroy her captors and the house, the prison.
Yeah, and to become the monster that Roderick was saying the whole time she had the potential to be, but is not because she's inherently evil and an usher. It's because of Roderick's insane way of treat method of treating her.
Right. Of course, we may be overreading this all because didn't Corman at one point say that the house is the monster? I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
he
he
had
did.
just a he had a much easier reading of the whole thing.
Well, Well, I mean, the house could be the symbol of all this stuff that she's rebelling against. I think our reading could still work. Also, who cares about authorial intent? I mean, Matheson wrote it.
That's true. That is true.
Well, you had mentioned
I
Bristol
will say
earlier. Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, do
no,
you
go
wanna talk
ahead.
about Bristol? Do you wanna talk about Bristol? Because
Yeah,
you had
let's talk
mentioned
about
him.
Bristol because he's such a weird little character. Yeah, the fact and talk about kind of the how for it to be a movie that is so straightforward about a woman being imprisoned in the home and men fighting over her and literally fighting over her body, you could kind of lean towards that patriarchal reading, but then there were a lot of weird gender flips. Like you mentioned that the men are just as susceptible to the the same kind of hysteria that has been historically applied to women. Um, but then you have Bristol, who for the majority of the scenes where he is speaking and actually adding something to the plot take place in the kitchen,
Yeah,
which
he's always trying to cook
I don't
food and give people things to eat.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, even though the ushers eat nothing but gruel.
Yeah, I don't know where he gets the other food. I guess it's his food.
Right, yeah. Oh, yeah, because he's always wanting to, like, cater to Philip. You know, he's always wanting to make him yeah, you're right, he is. He's offering him coffee or he is the caretaker of the Usher house, right? I mean, he's the one who provides kind of all the even he's the one because you would think that Roderick would be the person to do this, but when we first see Madeline, I guess in one of her cataleptic states where she's I guess sleepwalking, I don't know, but where they find her in amongst the graves and she's asleep. She doesn't know where she is, and he's the one who picks her up and takes her back to bed. And he makes that statement. You know, I've done this before. Be careful. Don't wake her. Like he's very loving towards her. He's very caring towards her. And I say that you would think it would be Roderick to do that because Roderick is so possessive over her. Like the energy I get from Roderick is that possession. It isn't a loving sort of relationship, but what you get from Bristol, he's not trying to control her, he's not trying to possess her, but it is a very loving, caring protection that you get from him, and that's I don't know, it's just a it's a really that was an interesting choice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Bristol's main place is in the kitchen, and yeah, he handles all the domestic chores around this house of horrors, and he's very mothering and nurturing in his relationship to Madeline. At the same time, he also you can tell he also kind of he cares about Roderick. I don't think it's too strong to say that because he doesn't necessarily want to contradict what Roderick says, but at the same time, he's kind of a compromising figure because he tries to kind of keep everybody happy and take care of everyone. Also, when they think that she's dead, um, Usher, when they're praying at her casket, Philip's devastated. Usher's just chilling, like he doesn't seem to care because he's been wanting her dead the whole time. But Bristol's like crying. I mean, Bristol's reacting as if it's a family member. So yeah, I definitely there's kind of like there's a loyal retainer because remember he says when the house falls down, I'll die. Like there's no point to him after that. Um, but he kind of is, I don't know, it's weird. Like he's kind of domestically imprisoned by the house too. And it could be a class thing, but it could also be an interesting gender flipping thing too. Yeah, it's interesting.
And he's the one who lets slip and it is kind of because you're right, he doesn't want to go against what Roderick says, but he's the one who let slip to Philip that she was given to catalepsy.
Mhm.
and kind of plants and I read it as he did it intentionally, even though he was kind of like, "Oops." He
Yeah.
plays it off as a mistake, but it did strike me that he did it on purpose. And so that was almost like an act of protection towards Madeline there too, in defiance of Roderick, because he plants the idea in Philip, because Philip is leaving, and he plants that idea in his head that she's been buried alive, that she actually was not dead at all, but had just kind of fallen into one of her states and is now waking up inside a tomb. So he starts the whole thing where Philip tries to get back into the house to help her. So yeah, it is interesting that he's, because that could have very easily have been given to a woman. That would have been the more traditional choice, I would think, of
Mhm.
like a mother character, but instead it was given to him.
Yeah,
Yeah, interesting.
this is changing the subject slightly, but that moment when Madeline realizes that she's been buried alive, where you hear her breathing in the locked box and then she screams, that is terrifying. The way they did that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um this movie, as a horror movie, I think still delivers a lot of creepy moments and a lot of scary moments. So it definitely, I don't know, I hate the term holds up, but it does. It is still an enjoyable watch in 2020, just as much as it was, I'm sure, in 1960.
Well, I mean, it was one of the top 5 box office hits in 1960, so it was probably the most popularly successful of the cycle, I would think. Um, it's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I realized that it was one of the top 5 box office hits. That's pretty I guess Vincent Price was probably at um the height of his popularity, but yeah, it's a good movie. I think, and that owes a lot to, I think, and I've said this again, but Richard Matheson's script, because it was both a faithful adaptation and just a really good story, a really good movie. So I highly recommend.
Well, I think with that recommendation, Lisa, for people to check this out, even in 2020, we will end it there. We hope, listeners, that you enjoyed our discussion of this particular Vincent Price, Roger Corman, Richard Matheson effort, and that if you haven't watched it, you will check it out. So, this is just a reminder that your co host, Lisa, and I wrote a nonfiction book about the women who have written horror and dark speculative fiction titled Monster She Wrote. You can get your copy by going to the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. And we here at No Fearcast would love to hear from you. We're at No Fearcast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, and we really do enjoy getting emails and hearing from listeners, please send us an email at nofearcast@gmail.com. And if you love what you're doing, if you love what we are doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to exclusive content. So during our off weeks, we have mini episodes that kind of continue the discussion. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.